Okay, well, thank you for your patience. And as you know, this is a panel about precision medicine, which is over my head, and maybe over the heads of some of yourself. But I'll try to help you along, and these doctors, very brilliant doctors, will answer your questions and mine. So we're going to start off with Dr. James Downing, whom I just met this morning. He's a very famous doctor. He's president and CEO of St. Jude's Children's Research Hospital, which is in Memphis, Tennessee. And he's made many, many breakthroughs in childhood cancer, which are stunning, actually, now that he's explained them to me and will explain them to you. So, Dr. Downing, it's astonishing while 20% of children with acute lymphoblastic leukemia were cured in 1976, 85% of children with the same disease can now be cured today. How did we get here? And what do you think are the next breakthroughs in childhood cancer? Because you were so interesting in the back room when you were talking about the breakthroughs that you've worked on in the past and the breakthroughs you foresee in the future in childhood cancer.
So, pediatric cancer really is one of the great success stories of modern cancer chemotherapy. And as you said, you know, if I had come down with pediatric cancer, or many of you in the audience, we wouldn't have lived. And today we have cure rates around 85% for all of pediatric cancer. You know, what really led to those breakthroughs is not new drugs. It was really an understanding of how to use current therapy in combination chemotherapy. It was understanding how to support patients through the toxicities that are associated with that chemotherapy. And it was understanding the biology of those pediatric cancers. And so we're here at a session on precision medicine, but really much of the progress in pediatric cancer has really come as a result of precision medicine. And it's really a story that goes back almost 30 years. Precision medicine really is individualizing therapy to a particular patient to afford them the best chance for a cure. And so to do that, one has to look at the tumor and understand the tumor. And we understood very early that pediatric cancer were many different diseases, and they had specific genetic lesions. Those genetic lesions defined a clinical entity. And some of those lesions, the patients did very well. Other lesions, they did very poorly. And so we started stratifying patients. Those with a high risk of relapse, we would treat more aggressively. Those with less chance for relapse, we would treat less aggressively. You know, as we've done more in precision medicine, we then started defining specific lesions and using that for new efforts to target therapy to individual patients. And then even beyond that, we started looking at the genetics of the individual patient. You know, how is the patient going to respond to that chemotherapy? Are they sensitive to the drug, or are they resistant? Do they need more of the drug? And what are the long-term complications to receiving that chemotherapy? We're curing children of cancer. We want them to live the rest of their lives. They're going to have complications as a result of that chemotherapy. And so it's that combination of looking at the tumor, looking at the patient, and then individualizing therapy. And so the progress in pediatric cancer really has resulted of that. And we're now at a point in time where we're applying that to all cancers, not just pediatric cancer, but every different type of adult cancer. And so the future, I think, in pediatric cancer, in many cancer, is this era of precision medicine. How do we actually do that today? How do we apply that in the clinic? How do we eventually get that to be applied to every patient in developed countries? And ultimately, how do we learn from that and allow it to be applied to every patient in developing countries, in middle-income countries? And so, to me, I think that's part of the future of all of us as we move forward to afford the best chance for a cure for every patient that has cancer.
So I think that the initial question, which I somehow overlooked, was supposed to be about this panel, as the doctor so brilliantly said, is supposed to be about precision medicine, which means that every cancer would be treated individually. And I think that it was President Obama who spoke of it, precision medicine as one of the keys to the future. And so I think that the original question was supposed to be for the panel, that by analyzing individuals and analyzing their risks and ailments, one day they'll be able to receive specific treatments for specific cancers. And I think that we were going to ask the panel as a group, how is this going to work? How expensive is it going to be? Is it realistic? And how do you see it, precision medicine? And that's our brilliant panel. You already met, this is my friend, Dr. Stephen Nimer, who's head of the Cancer Center at the University of Miami. You met the doctor from, I'm going to mess this up, and then there's from IBM, there's Dr. From Eli Lilly, there's Dr. Kalos, who also is Greek, in case you're interested. And then we have one more brilliant doctor. Help me out.
Oh, I'm Jedd Wolchok.
Jedd Wolchok.
Yep.
Okay, so anyway, gentlemen, do you feel like, and Jedd Wolchok is director of the Parker Institute for Cancer Immunology at Memorial Sloan Kettering, which I'm sure more than a few of you are familiar with in New York, the leading cancer institute in New York City, I would say. So would any of you like to talk about precision medicine as a group?
So I think precision medicine is a very broad term, and again, thank you for the invitation to come and speak. And you heard sort of what the broad goals of it are from Dr. Downing, and I do think that this is an achievable goal. I think that the advances that have been made in technology, in studying cancer cells from individual patients, are allowing us to identify variations in the disease that exist between people. We no longer talk about a cure for cancer. We talk about developing treatments for all kinds of cancer. This is a very individualized problem. If we've learned nothing else in the past 50 years, we've learned that. And it needs to be approached in the same way. So I think we are now at a point where we can break out of the prior way of developing medicines for cancer that were based simply on diagnosis and the way that cells looked under a microscope. That was the state of the art previously, still very important, but now we need to also focus on what's going on inside the cancer cells and develop therapies that address those specific problems. And even though that sounds like a daunting challenge, the technology is in fact evolving, and it's really due to partnerships between governments, academic organizations, and industry that we have been able to take on this challenge.
Yeah, I'd just add that, we've evolved from, and I don't know how many of you saw or read The Emperor of All Maladies, this, chemotherapies that had essentially no precision to them, right? They targeted the cancer, but they also had very bad consequences for normal cells to a time where we are almost at the other end of the spectrum, where we're able to now develop therapies based upon specific genetic mutations in specific cancers. And the technology where the initial sequencing of the first human genome costs hundreds of thousands of dollars, and we now can do it for less than $1,000. And in that information is the information that enables us to do precision medicine. And just to add to Jedd's point, not only across tumors of a given type is there variability, but even within a patient's tumor there's variability. So the level of precision medicine has to get down to that level where within a tumor there's different cells that we might have to target in different ways. That's the challenge is daunting, but we have the technologies, and we are now seeing the manifestation of the success through the examples that ipilimumab, nivolumab, the cell therapy approaches that are having such dramatic success in ALL as well as hopefully in solid tumors.
So if you think historically on the adult side, that probably one of the first examples of precision medicine was characterizing breast cancer as to whether or not it was hormonally responsive or not, ER and PR status. There you have a very common disease, and you have a very large population that would be hormonally responsive. And so that's one set of challenges, is to stratify, and that's done now routinely. Another example would be a certain type of leukemia called APL, where initially it represented 10% of leukemia, and in fact it's the 10% of leukemia that's curable almost 95% of the time. And so a rarer disease with a smaller percent of population that would be eligible for a specific therapy. And then you have what we see now, which is how do you deal with the fact that everyone's cancer could be different than everyone else's? So if you had 500,000 people in the United States with cancer, Do you have to come up with 500,000 different combinations? And how would you even know that something is best for a patient? Because once you've given drug A, the patient isn't the same before they've ever been treated, and so how do you know you shouldn't have given them drug B? So we have these incredible tools now to look further and further into the cancer. We have all this information, but the issue in part is, can we handle the information? Will the insurance companies pay for a very personalized approach? And even within our own institutions, if you have one trial open for 100 people, it costs X amount, but for the same 100 people, if you have to have 25 trials open, it's far more expensive. And exactly who pays for all these things that are needed so we can do our best.
And how are the pharma companies going to pay for individualized treatments for every cancer, even for every child, or for every adult, gentlemen?
I mean, I think, paying for this is a big question. I think, as you've heard, we have the technology, we have much of the infrastructure on a limited basis to do this kind of testing. But, how does one actually do it across, let's say, the United States, and how does one pay for that? And that's a major obstacle. Many patients don't have access to this. Many insurance companies are not paying for this. As Steve said, we can gain the information, but we really don't know how best to use the information. That has to be done in the context of clinical studies, whether they're therapeutic studies or whether they're participation studies. And so a lot of that needs to be put together. And it is going to be private-public relationships that do that. The White House Moonshot on Cancer is one of those initiatives that's come. So I was on the Blue Ribbon panel for the Cancer Moonshot Initiative, and that is a group of 28 of us that worked very hard over about a 4-month period to try to put together a list of initiatives that we thought were opportunities to accelerate progress in cancer. And many of those play directly on this topic of precision medicine. Can we get patient participation in precision medicine where they could, through the internet, enroll themselves on these protocols? Can we then fund the sequencing of those tumors and provide them information back that would direct them to the right therapy that they may be able to enroll in a clinical trial? A whole set of infrastructures develop a data ecosystem to pool that data, to access that data, to analyze that data. Large efforts to sequence retrospective samples because there's tremendous information to be gained there. So there is, we sit poised at a time where we have the ability, but there is much work to go forward to figure out how to use this and to make it accessible to all patients in developed countries and again in developing countries also. And so, those are obstacles, and a big one is who's going to pay for it. And
you and Steve were having a fantastically interesting conversation before we started about sharing, and you said that unless, of course, patients have to give their consent to share data, and so these two doctors were saying that unless the patients gave consent to share, it held back progress in cancer or treatments of cancer. And you also said, which I thought was fascinating, you also said that it posed dangers, and I'm sure your other two colleagues could chime in here too. You said that, for instance, you might know too much. You said you might know, for instance, that a 12-year-old girl was susceptible to breast cancer, and then you said the question was, did you tell the 12-year-old girl, or do you withheld? So you were saying that it's a question of, yes, you want to share, yes, you want to get as much knowledge as you can, but yes, you want to be careful. And I think you gentlemen, all four of you are so brilliantly equipped to discuss this, that you needed to be careful, I think, Dr. Downing, was what you said, with how you wanted to get as much information, but you wanted to be careful about how you progress with it, I believe.
Yeah, maybe I can just lead off, but our role as physicians is first do no harm. And information to a patient can change their life. It can change their life even if it's not a diagnosis of disease, it's just a diagnosis of risk of a disease. And sometimes that change can be good, sometimes that change can be very bad. And the patient needs to control whether they want that information or not. And so that's part of the thought process when we talk about sharing data. There is much information in that data. You know, I may go in for cancer or a potential cancer diagnosis, get a precision medicine test, and it says you've got a very high risk of Alzheimer's. I may not want to know that. I may not want that information. I may want to go through life blindly because that's my choice. So do I have that choice? And that's true on the individual patient basis. It's true when you start pooling data and you start looking at the data over time and new discoveries come out, and are you going to get access to that? And do you continuously control your decision whether to gain information or not through those kinds of collaborations?
I think that's a very real concern. We often find out more than we wanted to know. But I think also it's very important that we recognize that the type of precision medicine that we're discussing here is not available readily to everybody, even in a developed country like the United States. And I was on one of the subcommittees of the Blue Ribbon panel where it was actually our group that came up with this idea of allowing sort of a crowdsourcing of information from individual patients who would volunteer the genetic information from their tumors, regardless of whether they were being cared for at a large academic tertiary care hospital where this is done as a matter of course, like the University of Miami or Memorial Sloan Kettering, to bring this sort of access to people. But it sounds so simple, but it's actually not. We have people in this country who are vastly underserved in cancer care. There is an enormous shortage of oncology professionals in the United States that we are confronting. The oncology labor force is not replete to deal with the baby boomers who are now entering the highest risk of cancer of their lives. And so we have this technology, which if you live in New York City, for example, there are a number of places that can sequence 450 genes from your tumor and give you the answer in about 2 weeks. But if you live in a remote part of this great country, we really don't have the ability to mobilize that kind of resource very easily, simply because of sparsity of care.
You know,
Can I ask? Sure. Okay. I thought one of the most fascinating things that has happened recently, and actually I heard about it, I have to admit, from Steve, was, and I think our audience would be interested, is, as you all remember, I'm sure, Jimmy Carter was diagnosed with stage 4 melanoma. Correct me, Dr. Wolchok, if I'm wrong. And most amazingly, and of course he's not young, I might add, and most amazingly, I understand, he's been cured. He's been cured thanks to immunology, am I correct? So I wondered if you, Dr. Wolchok, I wondered if you could tell us about this, well, without being too explicit, if you could tell us what role do you think immunology will play in cancer cures? Is this just a one-off miracle, or is this kind of miracle going to happen frequently?
Thank you for the question. President Carter is doing extremely well. He does have a diagnosis of metastatic melanoma. He had surgery for liver metastasis and then radiation therapy for metastases in the brain. And then he began an immunotherapy, a medicine called pembrolizumab, just over a year ago. And he has done extremely well. All of his testing, as he has publicly disclosed, has shown that the cancer has not returned. We hope that that continues for many years, and he is able to participate in the wonderful activities that he does. What part immunotherapy played, along with the other treatment modalities that he received, we don't know, but we do know that that is a very challenging diagnosis. And with standard treatments, you know, there was not a high likelihood that we would be having this discussion about how well he is today without immunotherapy. For people with...
You can't prove that it was immunotherapy, but it's unlikely that it would...
I'd like to as an immunotherapist, but I can't. You know, but we do know that for a person with metastatic melanoma in the United States right now,
Stage 4, right?
Stage 4 metastatic melanoma, you know, the current FDA-approved therapies have about a 60% likelihood of causing a major regression, which lasts, you know, in general for a very long period of time. And this is a great step forward for a disease where the median survival before was about 7 months. So we've come a very long way, but the problem, as you can hear, is not solved. I did not say 100%. And it is that diversity, that heterogeneity that you've heard about from my colleagues that is driving us to understand differences between people and differences between tumors even in the same person. Now, the immune system represents a way to address that because it is a living group of cells and organs that shapes itself around different targets. It is able to morph itself around different infections. And so being able to recognize differences in cancer cells is something that the immune system is sort of singularly equipped to do amongst other cancer therapies. So we have a lot of hope for immunotherapy, but by itself, I think it is the answer for a relatively small subset of people with cancer in the world.
So that's why you would say that why does immunotherapy work only for some people and only against certain cancers? Is that the answer to that?
I think that is a very important question that we have in the field. It's something that we study every day. We think that the cancers that immunotherapy helps are those that have a significant amount of genetic damage, those caused by ultraviolet exposure like melanoma, those that are caused by tobacco exposure like lung cancer, head and neck cancer, bladder cancer, or those that are a result of genetic syndromes that cause many, many different mutations or genetic errors in the tumor. But we have to be very, very realistic and say that immunotherapy by itself is only the answer for a subset of people. It will need to be rationally combined and personalized with other treatment modalities for it to achieve its full effect.
Okay, now I'm going to ask Dr. Nimer a question, and if I sneak out, it's because I have to do an interview with a head of state for the Washington Post uptown, and so, as you know, the traffic is terrible. But Dr. Nimer is not only a friend of mine, he's a brilliant doctor. He was at Memorial, of course, for many years before he became head of the Miami Cancer Center. And he wants to talk about something way over my head. He wants to describe what epigenetics is and how does it figure in the development of cancer.
Thank you, Lally. So people are very aware of genetics, which is information that's encoded in the DNA. And there have been some major discoveries over the last decade or so in the field of epigenetics. So every cell in your body has exactly the same DNA, yet your liver cells are your liver cells, your brain cells are your brain cells, you have muscle. And so the ability of a cell to maintain its identity is not dependent on that DNA, but is dependent on the proteins and the DNA in a complex are compacted in the cell. That non-genetic component is called epigenetics. And so we've learned that in a lot of cancers there are mutations in the genes that control epigenetics. And on a global view, there are those of us who believe, similar to immunotherapy, that if we can understand how a cancer cell maintains its identity as a cancer cell, which is a very fundamental thing, and we can confuse the cancer cell about its identity by altering the epigenetics, then that cancer cell will either start behaving more normally or, in fact, will not be able to survive and will die. And so epigenetics is a burgeoning field. Jim Downing actually made a huge discovery in pediatric brain tumors to show that one of these key proteins itself can be mutated in cancer, which was a huge demonstration of the importance of epigenetics. But there are also now drugs that have been given. There's some great biotech companies that have these epigenetic inhibitors, and in particular in people whose cancer is mutated, there's a way to very precisely target these mutations. Some of these drugs are extremely effective and will enter the armamentarium of our cancer treatments. And so the other approach of epigenetics is the possibility, as Jedd Wolchok talked about, is that the immunotherapies need a target. And if the cell doesn't have a target, perhaps you can use epigenetic approaches to expose new targets that then can be recognized by the immune system. And so we're all talking about combinations of treatments for the future.
So I'm going to turn this over to Steve, and I'm going to ask one last question, which is I'm going to ask Dr. Kalos, which is how do we sustain the level of progress we've been making so far? And can you also talk about the costs of the new treatments, and how do we decide who should and shouldn't get the treatments?
Yeah, so I think a fundamental to sustain progress is a commitment to funding research. Essentially, everything that we've talked about here today has come out of the funding of basic research. So to be able to do that in perhaps in a more informed way than we have in the past, or more focused, I think is key to sustain progress. I think the other element that I'd add to that is we need to be thinking innovatively about how to move drugs forward. We've come again from treating patients with molecules that had very little probability of success and causing a lot of damage potentially to patients. So the development of these molecules has been sort of gated by that sort of a philosophy. We're at a time now where we're developing molecules with, Jedd's caveats aside, the potential for unprecedented benefits. So we have to think about how do we develop molecules in innovative, creative, perhaps even more aggressive ways, in partnerships between academics, pharma, and the government that really enables us to, through regulatory process, develop things properly. I won't speak to the cost. I'm a scientist. I work at pharma, but I'm a scientist, so I cannot speak to the cost. But I do think that tailoring strategies, that is, identifying patients and developing through basic research and through clinical studies, identifying what patients are going to respond and finding ways to do that most effectively is going to be a big component of the cost. So if we're able to do that, then the cost per patient is likely to be perhaps lower and maybe even justified. And she asked one more question before she left, but I'm blanking on it. Anybody know? Remember?
No.
Oh. How do you what? How do you choose? You do that through, as Dr. Wolchok talked about, to a large extent, through understanding the genetics of patients and understanding the responsive pattern of patients. Those are the patients that you choose to treat.
So if we could just get a percent from the three of you, what percent of people in the United States currently do you think with cancer benefit from precision medicine? Because we've talked about the communities lagging behind the academic centers. We know that most people with cancer are treated in the community, and so it's a huge opportunity for us all. What percent do you think we've realized it so far, Jedd?
I think at most half. And I think that's not just resources, but it's inability to identify appropriate precision targets and medicines for some of those targets in very common cancers. So if we look at sort of the elephant in the room of targetable, genes, it's KRAS, right? It's a major source of death in lung cancer. As you know, in hematologic malignancies, there are RAS mutations, and especially in pancreatic cancer and colorectal cancer. We do not have medicines that target that particular genetic error very well. And so while we can identify it very easily, we don't have an answer for it yet.
Jedd, just to clarify, half of the patients or 0.5%?
At half of the patients.
Half of the patients.
Jim?
Yeah, I think I would estimate lower. I think there are different levels of precision medicine, and so many breast cancer patients are getting, BRCA1 testing. Do they have a hereditary predisposition? They're getting estrogen, progesterone. They're getting other tests. That level, maybe more than half of breast cancer patients in the United States are getting it. But this modern wave of precision medicine where we're really trying to tailor therapy and gain an understanding of the range of mutations and the variability within a tumor, I think that is very small in the adult population. Less than 5% of the patients are enrolling on clinical trials and getting some kind of access to that next level. And I think that next level is going to give us tremendous insights. I think in the pediatric cancer population, it's different. In pediatric cancer, 60% of the pediatric cancer patients in the United States are on clinical trials. So we as a community work very closely and collaboratively to run those clinical trials. And so those patients, most are getting some access, but those getting access to the highest level of precision medicine, again, it's a small minority. We have to bring the group together and figure out how to provide that next level of precision medicine to all those pediatric patients.
Michael?
I'd simply say I think the fraction of patients, potential patients that enroll in clinical trials is quite small, right? So accordingly, the fraction of patients that have the benefit of truly precision medicine across tumors has to be quite small also. So how do we get more patients enrolled in clinical trials, in innovative clinical trials? And how do we more broadly apply the technology of precision medicine on patients are the two drivers that will get us to much higher numbers.
So I think we started a bit late, and I don't know if the timer in the back is accurate or not, but we were supposed to have some time for you all to ask questions. So if you'd like to ask a question, please either yell or find a microphone, or both. Yes. Oh.
Microphone coming. There.
Hi, I'd like to ask about getting insurance companies to pick up the tab on some of these precision medical tests. I have a relative who was given one of these tests, and he's fighting with insurance companies to get reimbursed because they're saying they won't recognize it as a treatment that they're supposed to be paying for. I think it's a huge issue for consumers in the United States, and people are very excited with the prospect of having new technology that can really pinpoint their problem and help them, in a very early stage, oftentimes get diagnosed and get treated, but they're concerned about how do they pay for it, and it's a back and forth fight between the insurance company, the consumer, and the doctor's office.
Yeah, well, I think part of the issue for the insurance companies, which we all believe on this panel they should be able to solve instantaneously, is the notion of looking at, let's say, 300 or 400 different genes, expecting to find a mutation in only a few of them. That's a little different than the classic paradigm where if you're looking at the kidney function, you order a kidney-specific test, which is also much cheaper. So we think that without insurance companies paying for these tests, that it's going to be impossible for us to accrue the information that'll allow us to institute precision medicine. And so I know this summit is a lot about private government partnerships, academic partnerships as well, and it's really a critical issue. I don't know, Jim, if the moonshot is...
I mean, the White House Cancer Moonshot Task Force, each of the working groups put forward policy issues that needed to be addressed, and this was absolutely one of them. How do you get the insurance companies to pay for this? And the concept that you're going to do this test on a patient, and for a significant proportion, it's not going to have any benefit for that patient, so they don't want to cover the cost. And we've got to change that paradigm. And so CMS, FDA will be developing more detailed approaches off of those policy recommendations that went forward to the White House Task Force.
Question? Yes.
Bone marrow to tackle some of the precision research in cancer.
I think you're talking about, bone marrow is a source of hematopoietic stem cells, and so it's a source that we use in transplantation, getting source of hematopoietic stem cells from a variety of sources, from cord blood, from bone marrow itself, from peripherally mobilized cells, and so those are just part of the armamentarium. Those cells or derivatives of those cells become one of the arms in cancer immunotherapy, where one will modify the immune cells and inject those back. So those are all part of the overall approach to tackling cancer. We look at precision medicine and targeted therapy, but we still have this chemotherapy, bone marrow transplantation, radiation therapy, surgery. That's always going to be part of the treatment of cancer. It's not that we're going to, take it and only give one little drug and they're going to be cured. It's going to be an all-out war on cancer with multiple treatment approaches, and I don't see those going away in this short to midterm. We're going to be continuing to use those. So this is one of those, I think.
I just simply say stem cells really have incredible potential therapeutically in the case of blood stem cells, understanding the etiology of cancer in the sense of solid tumors, tissue stem cells, being able to access those types of cells to understand them and utilize them therapeutically, I think is key for the scientific community.
A question in the back?
I think it ranges all over the place, but some of the precision medicine tests you get commercially are $4,000 to $5,000 per patient. Much more than an MRI would cost for the patient. As you heard, some of these you might be able to perform for under $1,000. At least to acquire the data, then to interpret the data might be more. So the costs are still high. In many sense, those costs are still prohibitive. And so one of the pushes forward is we've got to continue on the technology front, make the technology quicker, more rapid, to be able to, drive those costs down and make it more, accessible to patients across developed countries and low and middle income countries. I think the good news is the field's moving quicker than anything I've ever experienced in my 30 years of practicing medicine. And, I at one time thought this won't happen in the remainder of my career, and now I'm convinced it will. In the next 5 to 10 years, we will see these costs come down tremendously. We'll see our knowledge base gain, and we'll see the application of this kind of approach to many, many more patients around the globe.
So I'm being told that we need to wrap up the session, but maybe we can give everyone one last opportunity to say where they're hoping we'll make some big advance over the next.
Sure. I just would add one or two words about that last question. Is I think that's a good example of differences between where people get their care. That at a large academic center, what you are asking is already happening. That it is the first thing. Memorial Sloan Kettering just did its 10,000th test of a 400-plus gene panel for newly diagnosed metastatic cancer. But that's just not widely available, and that's what part of the Blue Ribbon panel tried to address, was to make that sort of precision medicine care much more widely available. I think the future is about combinations. I think it's about understanding how we bring together different treatment modalities to benefit the largest number of people.
Jim.
I think progress really, can only be made by collaboration and communication across the institutions, but really around the globe. I think there is much benefit to pulling in cancer efforts from around the globe and to coordinating that community, not only in developed countries, but in low and middle income countries, because most of the cancer burden in the world exists in those countries, not in developed countries, and the death rates are immense in those countries, and many are at a point where cancer care, is being developed. And so, how do we bring them into this? There is much for us to learn on the treatment and the follow-up of those patients, and so that needs to be, brought into the equation for us to really make progress on a global scale.
I think every generation of researchers believes that they're the generation that will crack this nut and will really crack the nut of cancer. And I think it's fair to say that our generation really is closer to that summit than anyone before. The data that's come out of, Jimmy Carter is one example. Jimmy President Carter is not the only patient. In fact, 10 to 15% of the patients that get treated with that treatment respond remarkably like he did. The ALL story with pediatric ALL and the story that came out of UPenn and other institutions where 85% of the children with no hope are now achieve a significant response, with about half of them having a complete response. How do we take that and give it to the next generation to really translate into success? It requires innovative thinking in academics, in pharma, in the government to regulate, and it requires innovation in how we interact to really get this to be the success story that it really has the potential to be.
And I'll just sort of follow up on that. There's more science available for us than ever before. Handling big data is a problem in medicine, just like in every other industry. And one of the problems that Jedd alluded to is how many physicians are being trained and how they're empowered to understand this science and apply it to patients, not just at the Sloan Ketterings or the Sylvesters or the St. Jude's of the world, but in every community. And so I think we have a huge challenge, which is the educational one, is to make sure that this next generation who's going to be taking care of us in the future has the tools and has the education as well. So I thank everyone for coming this morning very early and listening to our discussion. And of course, I thank the panelists and Mrs. Weymouth for helping put together this session. Thank you.